what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host Mike, and a big thank you for joining me for tonight's episode. On tonight's show, we're doing an emergency broadcast and we're going to be discussing the recent escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. It's now broken out into a full-blown war, and this is a major escalation in the global hybrid war, which we've been discussing here on the podcast. And I thought, what better way to make sense of what's happening right now than to look at what's happened in the past, specifically in relation to Iran, because this is a nation that's had a very interesting history. A human settlement has lived there for over 3 million years, according to the historical record, if you believe that. And also is the place where the Aryans came from. So this is where our first major civilization was said to have been. And one of the things that I wanted to discuss in tonight's episode is that history. So I'm sure this one's going to have some shocking moments for you, because when I learnt this history, it certainly shocked me. Definitely an important episode. Members, please head over to parallelmike.com to sign in and listen to the full show. And of course, if you're not a member yet, but you do enjoy part number 1, well, part number 2 of this one is extremely important. So maybe you'll consider coming over there to join us. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host, Mike, and we are joined once again by Moni. We're going to be discussing the situation over in Iran with Israel and this escalating conflict, which is biblical and it's also geopolitical, because there's many roads that lead to this conflict. It's been discussed for many years, and now it's here and it could get really bad. So we're going to be discussing that tonight, and I welcome you back to the show, Moni. How are you doing? And thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me back. I'm so thrilled to be back and chat with you about the current affairs, especially that things are speeding up, aren't they?
They definitely are. And we did that episode early in the year in January about the year of the snake. And we said that this year is going to be a year of huge transformations, lots of upheaval and the reshaping of the global order, financial systems, geopolitical. And we've had so much happen already. We've had Trump's new presidency, which has upended the global economic order with tariffs. We had the Pope die. We've had Assad in Syria had to flee to Russia. So much has happened. And now, of course, we've got this big conflict. So it really has been that year of transition and change. But we've still got 6 months to go. And this one has only just begun. So lots to get into. And I'm seeing a lot of people discuss this right now. But one thing that I haven't seen anyone discuss is the history of Iran and what actually led to this situation where we've got this theocracy in. And I think that's with good reason, because the history brings to light lots of things that people don't even know about. And it also shows you some of the hidden hands that were at play in Iran over the past 100 years. But what about you, Moni? Did you know much about Iran before what recently happened? Have you ever been there? Have you ever looked into the history?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I've never been there myself, because I used to travel alone, so I didn't dare. However, I've met some people from Iran and they were very nice. I know more Persian history because Iran has got a fantastic long history. This is where our civilization has started. This is Mesopotamia, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there's been a civilization there for thousands and thousands of years. If you go back to Babylon, it's written about in the Bible, of course. So Iran was Babylon, then it became Persia, and today we call it Iran, which actually means home of the Aryans. And you'll know that European history has got a really important chapter all about Aryanism with Hitler and the Nazis. which we can speak about later on. But yeah, people call Iran the cradle of civilization because so much happened there. In fact, there was actually a settlement there going back all the way 3 million years ago. So that's how long people have occupied this region. And today it's kind of like a mishmash of all different places that were put together into this one place called Iran. And it's the most mountainous region in the world. It's got quite a large population. Yeah, the history is very interesting, particularly the last 100 years, because that's where you realize that the West, and particularly the same old in terms of the names, the big families and the oil companies, the oil barons, they've been in control in Iran for the last 100 years. Now, you could arguably say that for the past 40, 50 years, they haven't. But if you go back to the early 1900s and go forwards from there, pretty much the entire modern history of Iran was shaped by Britain and America at the behest of the oil barons who were trying to control Iran's oil. So it's a very fascinating history, and it really does shine light onto what might be going on there today and what the reasons for it might be.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I saw your latest episode of Parallel Systems broadcast, and you drew lightly on this topic, so I would love to hear more about it. But it doesn't surprise me that there would be Western companies and countries trying to get the grab on oil and riches of the smaller country.
Yeah, well, you could argue that the best thing that ever happened to Iran was they found oil, and the worst thing that ever happened to Iran was they found oil. And it was actually a man called William Darcy. He was an Australian man, and he was the guy who found oil in Iran, or Persia as it was back then. And he'd struck his wealth through prospecting for gold, actually, in Australia. They found gold in Australia. He had shares in a company. And by the time he sold his shares, they were worth around £900 million. And this was back in the late 1800s. So he was almost a billionaire back then. Then he moved across to London. And he thought, I'm going to try and find oil because there's this growing boom for oil and we're going to be able to use it in industry. So he decided that he was going to go to Persia and actually look for oil there. But he wasn't going to go himself. He was just going to put up the money. So they approached the Shah of Iran at the time, and this was from the Qajar dynasty. So this was the ruling dynasty before the Pahlavi dynasty, which came later. They overthrew the Qajar dynasty. But back then it was Muzaffar al-Din Shah Qajar of Persia. And they said, if you allow us to prospect for oil for 60 years, and they asked for a massive amount of territory, but bearing in mind Persia is a huge country, we'll give you £20,000, which was around £3.2 million today, and a promise to pay 16% of future profits. So they get 16% of any revenue. Now, by the time you got to 1908, so this was about 8 years into the prospecting, nothing had been found. And he'd put over £500,000 in, so it was costing him a fortune. £500,000 back then was tens of millions. In fact, I think he almost bankrupted himself trying to find oil. And just as he was about to give up, his man over in Persia, he said to him, listen, we're done. We've had enough. This is killing me. He said, sell any equipment that you can sell. Send back anything that's viable and just leave the rest. Just get out the country. Well, the guy didn't stop. So he got the memo, but he continued to prospect. And it's like one of those myths that, sure enough, just as he was about to quit, they struck oil. And they created a company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And this is the oil company that basically had control of Iran's oil right up until the 1940s, 1950s, when you had all of these other oil companies, the Seven Sisters, as they call them, the Big Seven, start to swoop in as well. So that's how oil was struck in Iran. Now, the oil contract, 16%, was fine at the beginning, but as time went on, there was like, wait a minute, you guys are taking like 84% and we're getting a measly 16%. And they were seeing all of this natural wealth escape the country. And that's where things started to go wrong, because actually what happened was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the British government was the secret shareholder. So they actually bought out most of the shares. So by the time you got to this point when they was trying to renegotiate the oil deal, you wasn't renegotiating with William Darcy. That guy had long since sold his shares. You was renegotiating with the shadow shareholder, which was the British government. So when the Qajar dynasty said, listen, we want a better deal, the British government said, well, what's easier, to give you tens of millions of pounds, which back then was fortune, or just to get rid of you, or to install a puppet on the Iranian throne. So they said, yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll get rid of you. So they did a military coup and actually put in a guy called Reza Pahlavi, who was the first Shah of Iran of the Pahlavi dynasty. And his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was the infamous Shah of Iran, who you might have seen videos or photos of on YouTube. But a lot happened in between. I mean, even Reza Pahlavi got ousted in the end. They put his son in, but they actually got rid of him because he tried to renegotiate. So it's a long and sordid history. And there's so many other bits we haven't even discussed. But I'm going to hand it back to you because I've already thrown a lot of words at you, Manny.
No, I'm glad. It's fascinating history. I never heard that story. It's totally a Hollywood story when you think that someone nearly got bankrupt before they found what they were looking for. But actually, that reminds me of a story I've heard when I lived in Turkey about the end of Ottoman Empire. And apparently, British and Germans were helping Sultan back then at the beginning of 19th century build a railway, and they were building it all over the place because they had a deal that they would do it cheaply, or if not for free, in exchange for whatever they find on the way. It's theirs, including resources, artwork, you name it. And they were looking for something as well. So that reminds me as well where the Western countries were sort of focused trying to find something specific, be it oil or something else, and the rulers of the Eastern countries didn't really maybe appreciate what they were owning.
Yeah, and also they probably just wasn't aware of the devil they was dealing with, because if you think about the empires that they were engaging with, they'd never seen anything like that. The power and the level of subversion and Machiavellian tactics that were used against them. So although at first they probably thought they could open the door to these people because they themselves had all this power, but it was more of a tribal power. You know, it was done by force and local warlords. But then you had a genuine, bona fide army that could fight. They could just be sent in at any point, or they could just instigate coups in the country and pay off the clerics or the mullahs or the gangsters or whoever. And that's precisely what they did. And they kept doing it over and over. So at every point in the chess game, the local populace and the local leaders were always being outsmarted by these foreign Machiavellis, which was the British and eventually the US as well. But remember, their tactics came from Venice. So you had the Venice intelligentsia and the Venetian black nobility, who were notorious for being a very small, tight-knit group with a lot of money. And they control the world through tactics like blackmail and subterfuge and putting one power against another power and playing everyone off against one another. So they were experts at that. And that's really what the British became. And then when they started to deal with all of these more tribal places where you definitely had very smart, I mean, like I said, Iran was the cradle of civilization. So it's not like these people were backwards. They were extremely smart, but they just never come across people who were that power hungry. They might have been power hungry, but they met their match in these people. And, you know, going back to what we was talking about with the oil company, the Anglo-Persian oil company, going into the First World War, their biggest customer was actually William Churchill. He actually wanted to fuel the British Navy. They were still using coal back then, so they were trying to switch over to oil. And they were dependent on American oil and also Royal Dutch Shell. And that's, of course, the royal family of the Netherlands. So he wanted to get a more independent source, and that turned out to be Iran. So that's why Iran became so crucial to Britain, because it was actually fueling their navy. So they needed to keep Iran under the thumb. And anyone in Iran who tried to renegotiate the deal or cut off oil was considered a marked person, let's say.
Oh, that's interesting. Actually, I wanted to ask you how World War I has shifted and changed the situation in Iran, if any at all. But now you mentioned Churchill as well. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Going into World War I, we still had the Ottoman Empire. Can you believe that? It seems wild that we had all of these empires. But World War I was really similar to a time period that we're going into now, because I always say that World War I going into World War II was the transition period of the last reset. And now we are in the same period where we're seeing the global chessboard being flipped in the air, and certain people, certain families, certain powers are going to be knocked off the chessboard. So going into World War I, who was it? It was the Ottoman Empire. It was the Habsburgs. It was the Romanovs. And that got rid of some, but then there was still some more chopping and changing to go. So then we had World War II, which consolidated all of the power, mainly with America, who was going to be the successor to the British Empire. And they had all of the gold, they had all of the power and the influence. And so that's what happened. So I think we're in the same period, but just going back to what you were saying, in World War One, Persia was actually neutral. So they supplied oil through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to the British. They did have skirmishes and things going on, but they ostensibly were fine throughout World War One. But after World War One, they decided to get rid of the Qajar dynasty, because they said, well, we want to renegotiate this oil contract because you're taking all this oil out of the country and we want a better shake, because if we had to do this deal with you now, there's no way we'd have done it for 16%. We'd have asked for 50%. So they said, we'll take 25%. That's good enough. You give us 25% and we'll sign on the dotted line. But the British said, well, it's probably just easier to get rid of you guys. And that's precisely what they did. So they took a general, his name was Reza Shah. And basically what happened was he was part of the Persian Cossack Brigade, and he became a really good general in the end. And they elevated him to captain, then colonel in 1915. And then by 1921, he was the leader of the entire Cossack Brigade in a certain province. And they told him, the British, to march on Tehran and seize the capital. So that's precisely what he did. Now, bearing in mind, there was a prime minister, so it wasn't just out-and-out monarchy. They had a parliament. And the plan at that point was basically to just install a puppet prime minister who was going to renegotiate the deal, because the Qajar dynasty were trying to nationalize. And this is really the story of Iran. If you start in 1900s, you've basically got a succession of leaders trying to renegotiate at some point the oil contracts with the big oil companies. And at that point, the secret services in America and the CIA would go in, overthrow them via a coup, and put somebody else on the throne who, to begin with, would be very docile. They would placate them. But as they became wealthier, they became more powerful. They thought, you know what, I've got enough power now to kick these guys out. And they never succeeded, because every time they tried it, another coup would happen. And that's the story of Iran. But, it gets more interesting when you get to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the son of the first Shah of Iran. He was a very interesting man. And there's some fascinating interviews on YouTube with him. And I'm actually going to splice in some clips of those interviews as part of this podcast. It's not something I normally do, but I think it really just helps give you a flavor of who this man was and the kind of attitude that he had, and just how candid he was as well. He was somebody who spoke in a way that I've never heard any other politician over the last 100 years speak. Not even, I would say, Vladimir Putin. People think Putin's quite candid, but nobody was as candid as Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah, I've seen those interviews online. They're amazing. Actually, I was surprised that you can still search them. But would you mind if we come back a bit early to World War II? And do you know what Hitler was looking for in Iran?
Well, Hitler was fascinated with Iran because he called it the home of the ancient Aryans. And when Hitler enacted the Nuremberg laws in Germany, so these were the laws that were discriminatory and racist against the Jews and basically anyone of descent that was not pure. So it would be people like Romas or Slavs. Iranians were the only ethnicity that were exempt. So if you were Iranian, it didn't matter because you were classed as a pure Aryan. And Hitler did everything he could to court Persia. And he actually was very good friends with Reza Shah. So the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, he would send him gifts. He wanted to create trade with them. He wanted to give them loans. And he said, listen, no matter what happens, we are going to, at some point, reunite. So Iran and Germany, we're going to combine our forces. So he was in adoration of Iran because, he saw that as literally the place of this pure civilization. That's where it all went back to.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think he was looking for some sort of artifacts in there as well, but I'm not sure.
The Nazis, well, they were looking for artifacts across the world, but it was all really occulted because they were trying to find magical artifacts or artifacts that were relics that had some connection to Christ or to different mythologies. The Spear of Destiny, for example. So they were going across the world on this giant search for treasure and for things that could give them this supernatural power, because, make no mistake, the Nazis were deeply occulted, as any elite family or faction that's trying to take power is. Because, of course, if you're going to try and take power and you're going against people who have these mystical and supernatural beliefs, you will naturally have them yourself. You'll think, well, I need to tool up. I need to get some of these black magicians to help me. And then, of course, you look for artifacts. Like if we go back to the Knights Templar, they had Baphomet, the head, which they used to worship. And apparently during the ceremonies, this head would come to life and start speaking. It's really creepy to think about. But wherever I look throughout history, the moment you scratch beneath the surface, you find all kinds of magic and occultism that was taking place. And I think it's because they understand that there are things out there, energies that can be manipulated. I think Jacob Nordengard, on a past episode for listeners who have listened to it or might want to go listen to it, we discussed this in that episode. He says the same, that yes, there are energies out there. There's natural energies. They're neither good or bad. But if you understand how to harness them, you can certainly turn them to good or bad. And I think Hitler understood this too. So there's lots of things we could discuss in terms of that part of history. And maybe one time we'll do an episode on it. I know we discussed it a little bit in the episode on the Bretton Woods Agreement, how the Western superpowers basically took the Nazis' economic plan and adapted it. But going back to World War II, yeah, Reza Pahlavi was a friend of Hitler, and Hitler was doing everything in his power to become an ally of Iran. But Iran already had a pre-existing relationship with the British, and the British became extremely paranoid by this, because not only did they have oil in the country, which they was exporting, and they needed, of course, for the war, because that was fueling the Navy and all the planes. So it was strategically extremely important. But then also there was a massive railway that had been built from north to south in Iran that was being used to funnel goods up and down to Russia, because Russia was close to Iran. Once Russia became an ally of the Allied powers, they needed this railway too. So Russia and Britain eventually got together and said, we can't risk losing Iran because this guy looks like he's turning towards Hitler. So they did a surprise invasion and they invaded the country, completely shocked the hell out of Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, and they took it within just a few days, and he had no response. There was nothing he could do. And they remained there until after the war. So they ensured that it was strategically secured at that point. And then after the war, they made a new agreement about the oil too. So they said, we want a new contract. And I think the new contract was for something like 16 years. And of course, that contract was for the oil companies as well. So what you'd see during times of war was the oil companies would use nations to secure their assets. And we've seen this throughout history, including modern history too. The first thing they do when they go into a country and invade it is they secure the assets for the corporations. And that's precisely what happened too in Iran. So yeah, that was the story of Iran during the war. And actually, the reason why they went into Iran, or at least the justification they gave, is because they asked Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, to expel Germans, and he refused. No, they actually asked him to turn them over, to trap them, lock them up and turn them over, and he gave them a secret way out. So they said, right, well, now we know you're working with the Germans, so we're coming to invade you, and that's what happened.
Oh, wow, what a turn of events. I didn't know that. But it's interesting how a country can get locked in because of the resources that are essential for whatever is happening at the moment. So in the war, it was essential for keeping the war. The moment oil stopped, the war stops, isn't it?
Well, that's the crazy thing about the war. There's so many nations that were providing parts and services and resources for the war. And they actually said in World War II that Germany couldn't have enacted the war without one silly little part that was being made in one country. Like you literally could have just bombed the hell out of that one country and the war stopped. And it's because the corporations are actually the ones enriching themselves in the war. The nations are just pawns in the game, you could say. It's actually just very powerful people playing a game against one another and trying to steal a bigger piece of the pie. And that's the best way of understanding it. And I think that's the best way of understanding what we're living through right now, because people really struggle to make sense of it all. Like, what's going on? I see nations are going against each other. Are they all controlled opposition? And I would say no, there's genuine antagonism. There are genuine conflicts, but it's not the conflicts you think. It's not a conflict between a nation versus another nation. It's actually a conflict between the very wealthy and the very elite, as they use nations as pawns in the game, trying to increase their power. And I think it's a biblical story that we're living through as well. We're going towards some kind of end times where they're going to try and create and conjure up the Antichrist. Well, they're not going to create it. the Antichrist energy already exists, but they're going to try and imbue that in somebody. And I think that's their view. Whether you believe that or not, it really doesn't matter. That's kind of their ideology. And that's why this Iran piece of the puzzle is so important, because this goes back to biblical prophecy that there's going to be a great war, and the Bible discusses the great war and it talks about a country, and most people believe that's going to be Iran. So that this has happened now at a time when we've already seen other prophetic parts of that story is really important too.
So what we might see is a repeat of what happened in Iraq and in Iran as well. Like perhaps they will grab artifacts and precious places as well. Yeah, you never know.
I think they would want to, but the other thing as well is if we go back to Iraq and the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein was another one of those leaders that was installed by the Western powers. His reign there was maintained through support from MI5 and the CIA up until the point they'd had enough of him. And then what did they do? They deposed him and got rid of him, invaded the country. He had a really bad death. And the nation is now well and truly wrapped up and taken control over by Western powers, which is similar to what happened in Iran. They would install somebody, and when they got tired of that person or that person tried to assert themselves, they'd just discard them.
Yeah, so what happens after World War II, especially when the oil contract expired?
Yeah, so after World War II, they basically decided that Reza Pahlavi had to go. They thought he'd become too independent and too autonomous, and he was also seeking to revise the oil contract again. And he did revise it, actually. He'd revised it going into World War II. He did improve it somewhat. So he took some lands back and he got a special dividend. So they weren't happy about that. So they were already out to get him. World War II kicked off, so they kept him. But then at the end of the Second World War, having occupied the country, they was like, right, it's time for you to go, buddy. And the British actually said to him, and I've got a quote here, "Would His Highness kindly abdicate in favour of his son, the heir to the throne? We have a high opinion of him and will ensure his position, but His Highness should not think there is any other solution," which was a very polite way of saying, get the hell out or you're done. So, of course, he did abdicate, and they actually were not planning to put his son on the throne. They actually wanted to reinstall the old dynasty, the Qajar dynasty. That was the plan, but the heir of that throne couldn't even speak Persian. So there was like, there's no way we can use this guy. The locals won't support him. So they decided to put Crown Prince Mohammed Reza Pahlavi as the Shah. Now, at that point, he was only a young man. He was in his early 20s. So he was not fit to rule the country. But remember, they had a parliamentary structure. So they said, well, put him in as the puppet, and then we'll just have prime ministers who we can control. And that's what they went for. So it worked for a while because Mohammed Reza Pahlavi basically lived in his palaces and lived a decadent life, and he was completely hands off. And the new prime minister they put in renegotiated the deal and basically went back to the old deal. But over time, successive prime ministers became more and more dominant and more confident and self-believing that by the time you got to the 1950s, they were threatening to nationalize the oil supply of Iran. And at that point, they did a coup, and it was a color revolution. So it's very similar to the ones that we see today. And at this point, it was the CIA because you had lots of the American oil companies involved. It wasn't just the British. So at that point, they said, listen, let's put this Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, as the autocratic ruler. We'll get rid of the prime minister and we'll make him much more powerful, and we'll deal only with him because he's been a good puppet. Or so they thought. So they did that. They did a coup. They funded the coup, and they essentially got all of the clerics and the mullahs, so these are the religious leaders in the country, to pay off gangsters and mobsters and to start riots in the streets. So it was a color revolution. And they had complete control. Their agents were all over the country. So the idea that Iran was autonomous, no, at any point they could foment this kind of discord. And that's what they did. And it led to the installation of Mohammed Reza Pahlavi. Now, I should have mentioned as well, his father was exiled. So his father was exiled and put under house arrest and eventually died under house arrest. So they wanted to make sure he never came back. And yeah, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi became the Shah of Iran. And he was indeed the last Shah of Iran because he ruled basically from 1941 all the way up until 1979 when the Iranian Revolution toppled him. And just as a little teaser, 1979 was also the year the contract with the oil companies ran out, which he refused to renegotiate. So nice coincidence there. That's also the year that he got toppled.
It's a very good coincidence. It seems like this is what's running the place, isn't it? It's interesting how people that they put in power or institutions they put in power eventually come back to the idea of, yeah, we want to provide more for our nation and we want to look after our people, isn't it? So they don't want to be to have the resources stolen of them, which doesn't surprise me as well. But the last Shah, isn't it the one that it's very famous? Maybe not famous, but I know that many people have watched his interviews in English, directed or recorded in 1970s, where he is extremely impressive with his clarity of expression, but also he is so well balanced in what he says and says just enough to slightly uncover the inner works of politics.
Well, he was a real statesman. He was a real statesman, extremely intelligent. He understood how to speak, and he had that air of authority about him at all times. When you watched him, you felt like he is the real deal, and he is royalty. You know, if there is such a thing as royal blood, listening to him and watching him, you could imagine it. That guy has royal blood because, yeah, he just had that decorum that you don't see anymore. So it was a genuine article, and I think that's why he became so troublesome. And those interviews that he was doing for an American audience, it was an annual interview where there would be a guy from America's 60-minute show go across and interview him in his palace. And as you went through the decade, the 1970s, these interviews became more and more combative, and he became more and more critical of the West and started to actually say more and more things that the West wouldn't probably want saying, particularly America and also Israel. Now, it's very interesting because he had been an ally of Israel and an ally of the US because he was dealing oil with them, but he also was becoming more and more powerful and authoritative in his own right, and he had become a billionaire, of course. The whole country was paying tribute to him. His family was super rich by this point. And I think he understood that, well, he believed, should I say. He didn't understand, but he believed that he had more power than he did. And when he actually had to flee after the 1979 revolution, he wrote in his book, one thing that impressed him about the US that he couldn't get over was just how much power they could wield. So it took him by surprise. But we'll play some clips of what he said in some of these interviews. I'll play some clips probably at the end of part one, and then I'll do another one at the end of part two, just so as to not to interrupt the flow too much. But what he said in those interviews, like, for example, talking about the 1970s oil shock. For those that don't know, the 1970s was a period of massive inflation. It was stagflation, actually. We had a depressionary environment and then lots and lots of inflation. And there was multiple oil shocks because of wars in the Middle East, including the Yom Kippur War. There was the oil embargo. And Iran at that point was one of the world's largest oil producers. So they were producing a lot of oil. They were sending it across to the US. And they was also sending it to Israel secretly because a secret pipeline had been built from Iran to Israel. Now, this is something we're going to talk more about in part number 2, the secret pipeline, because it really does suggest that something else was going on in Iran even after the theocracy was installed. But we'll come back to that one later. But in any case, he became more critical of the Jews. And he actually said in his book that he believes the Americans had overthrown him, but privately he said that he believes there was an international conspiracy from the Jews to get rid of him. That's why he became more critical in his words. And he actually said in one of those interviews that the Jewish lobby control America. And this was back in the 1970s. So you can imagine how shocking this was back then. Today, lots of people are saying that, but back then nobody was saying that. So a very interesting man, a very interesting man. I was actually looking today at some photos of him, and I was looking at the watches of the Shah of Iran, and he had a gold Nautilus, a Patek Philippe, he had a Rolex. He was just the epitome of class, decadence, but also he could speak. And in those interviews, you couldn't get away with a thing. If you said something and he wasn't happy about it, he would run rings around the interviewer. I wouldn't say I admire him, but I certainly have a respect for how he held himself and also just the way he was able to communicate. It was very effective.
Extremely effective because those interviews are telling you a lot of things that are not normally spoken about. But at the same time, they've been published and you can still find them online. So he definitely knew how to strike that balance between telling you enough, but not so much so that there could be any precautions of what you say. So
Yeah, he said as much as he wanted, but not one word more. And if you pressed him, he would assert himself. He was very assertive. He'd say, no, I've said what I wanted to say.
those interviews are really fascinating, but I wonder, what's the purpose? Why did they record them and publish them? Shah was so intelligent, he surely must have known that those journalists were a CIA asset.
Well, yeah, absolutely. He knew because he knew that they helped get him on the throne to begin with, that his entire reign as the Shah of Iran had been fueled by the CIA and Western intelligence agencies. So he was acutely aware of what those interviews were, but he also understood that not only was he expected to do those interviews for propaganda purposes, but those interviews were also a chess match between him and the Western intelligence agencies. So he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He had to do these interviews in a sense. He could have declined them, but I think he did definitely have an air of narcissism about him. And I don't say that in necessarily a negative sense, but clearly he had a very powerful sense of self. You can see that in the interviews. So I think these interviews were used originally to propagandize the Western audience and to introduce them to this Shah of Iran who was Westernizing. But as he became more and more belligerent, what you notice is in those interviews, the questions become much more combative. And the guy, Mike Wallace, who was a famous reporter in the US, he was the guy tasked with interviewing the Shah of Iran. And clearly he was an expert interviewer. And what you notice, Moni, about these interviews is the questions that he asks are hot topic things, and he's trying to get a rise out of the Shah. And this is because as you get to the 1970s, when the Shah is becoming more and more autonomous and creating more problems for the West and essentially telling the oil cabal that he's no longer going to serve them, they purposely start to poison the well in terms of the media around him. So as these interviews go on, the questions become much more pernicious. And they're asking him things that they're trying to really, I would say, expose him or get an emotional rise out of him. And so you're watching these interviews as a viewer, even from this vantage point, all these years in the future. And so long as you understand what's really going on, it's a very interesting look at psychology because you're seeing two people who both know exactly what the other one is. Mike Wallace knows that the Shah of Iran is an asset of the West, but also becoming somewhat unruly. The Shah of Iran knows that Mike Wallace is there to try and get a rise out of him and expose him. So it's a bit of a chess match between the two. And it reminds me actually of the recent interview that we saw between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. Do you remember that one? So yeah, those interviews are fascinating if you enjoy seeing the psychological warfare that goes on between two sides of a game where they know what the game is, but they also understand the audience has no idea what's going on. But if you understand that, then it makes for a fascinating viewing. And I certainly have picked up on a few points when I watched those interviews where I'm like, I just saw a break in the character where the Shah got angry or he showed some pride or something flashes across his face that just tells you that they got to him for a moment, but then he gets his composure back. So definitely worth watching so long as you understand what's going on. And I would say it's far more interesting to watch these things when you understand the true narrative as to what's happening there, that there's two people that are very suspicious of each other. They're also likely friends off camera because they have had this relationship, but they know that, at least from the Shah's perspective, the other guy's got daggers out and is seeking to stick him in his back because he works for the CIA. He's part of Operation Mockingbird. But, he was essentially a puppet of the West for most of the early part of his reign. Because when they got rid of the prime minister in the coup, prime minister was called Mohammad Mossadegh. He did nationalize the oil. There was a period in the 1950s where he tried to renegotiate with the oil companies and they said, who's this guy? This prime minister? They said, no way. So he said, okay, we're going to nationalize the oil. So they did a massive embargo on Iranian oil. and they couldn't sell it. They were actually getting less money than they was getting under this crappy deal because nobody could buy from them. And this is, of course, what the West does all the time, even today. For example, today, there's an embargo on Venezuelan oil. So if Venezuela want to sell their oil, they have to sell it at a discount and reroute it through 10 different countries to get it around the world. So in the end, they did the coup and they installed the Shah. The Shah was already in power, but they installed him as I said before, the autocratic ruler. And immediately, they got an agreement out of him called the Consortium Agreement. And I'll just read you from the Wikipedia page. It says the Consortium Agreement of 1954 provided Western oil companies with 50% ownership of Iranian oil production after its ratification in 1954, expiring in 1979. That was the year of the Iranian Revolution that deposed the Shah. According to the consortium agreement, 40% of Iran's oil shares belonged to 5 American companies. The other 40% belonged to Iran-UK oil companies. So these were the British oil companies. The Anglo-Iranian oil company actually is BP, British Petroleum. That's what spawned out of it. Also, Royal Dutch Shell, which was owned by the royal family. And the remaining 6% belonged to a French oil company. And it says, in spite of numerous negotiations and offers, Mohammad Reza Shah refused to extend the agreement, which originally and clearly postulated that the consortium had a right to prolong it for 15 years. So in 1979, they had the right to prolong it for another 15 years. But by that point, he'd had enough. He'd seen enough. And he said, no, we're not extending it. And sure enough, he was deposed. And he died 2 years later. He'd been treating himself for cancer. For a number of years, he ended up in exile. And Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time, couldn't stand him. And it was believed that Jimmy Carter helped the coup. So it got the CIA to, again, fuel the clerics and the mullahs and to create dissent. And the Ayatollah, who they replaced him with, the Shah of Iran, said, if you look under that guy's beard, it says made in England because he's an operative. His father couldn't even speak Persian. He was born in England. So he was definitely an operative that had been sent there for the job. And he remained in power. And that's what happened. They got rid of him. And he sadly died. But interestingly, his son is still alive. And right now, his son is being tipped as the guy who is going to replace the theocracy. He is being courted by Israel. So he's been across there multiple times, been meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, lots and lots of posts on X from Israeli politicians saying this guy soon is going to be in Tehran. So that's the goal now, is to actually reinstall the Shah, even though the regimes of the West got rid of the Shah in the 1970s and replaced him with the theocracy. Now, there's some questions here that I'm sure you've got, like, well, if they were so interested in Iranian oil, why did they replace him with a theocracy who couldn't manage the oil, and oil collapsed after that? But we'll speak about that in part 2. There's lots of stuff we can get into. But is there any more questions for part number 1, Moni? I feel like we've covered a lot. I feel like we've discussed a lot of history, and yet I feel like we've barely touched upon it. There's so much more that we could have discussed.
No, you've been great. And you really shocked me with one thing, that secret pipeline going to Israel. Do you know anything more about it? It's just shocking, like how a pipeline could be secret. Building it would have involved millions of whatever currency there was, and lots of manpower.
But what's really interesting is how long that pipeline continued to flow after the theocracy and the Ayatollah was installed. Because supposedly, in mainstream history, they hated Israel and it was game over for the oil. Not true. That oil flowed for many, many years afterwards.
Just no one knew about it.
Nobody knew about it.
There's so much we don't know. How interesting. Right. I think that's great and enough for part 1 then. Unless there's something else you would like to add.
Well, one thing that I would say is that what's happening right now in Iran, it could be looked at from many different perspectives, but the perspectives that I've seen thus far from people, it's very mainstream, and I think it misses the point. So looking back through the history of a nation is very useful, and hopefully this one's give listeners some insights into what was really happening over there. But also, I'd say we could take many different views on what comes next. You can look at this from the perspective of America versus China, because a lot of the conflicts that have happened recently, so the Russia-Ukraine, it's a proxy war because Russia is a junior partner to China and they're collectively trying to create a new currency that de-dollarizes and uses gold and commodities. Or you could look at it in terms of the collapsing post-World War II order that we're going through this period where lots and lots of very powerful entities are fighting to get a bigger piece of the cake and to gather up resources and knock out competitors. Or you could look at it from a religious or a biblical perspective that actually we're going into some kind of great unraveling, spiritually speaking, the end times. And again, all of this would align with what's happening right now in Iran. So you can take your pick or you can use them all together. But one thing I would caution people from doing is to make quick judgments and to fall into the propaganda narratives that are being put out there in the mainstream and also the alternative media too. And I don't really look at this thing from a perspective that I understand it, that I truly know. And I don't pick sides because I don't think we even know which sides we're picking. How can you pick a side when you don't know who's truly behind what? How can you understand Iran when we don't really know who they are or what they are? Because, as I said, if you look at what Iran became after the end of the last Shah's reign, those people that were installed were also, in my opinion, installed by the same people who installed the Shah. So did their control in Iran ever end? Is this just all one big theatre? That's the question that we'll take with us into part number 2.
That's great. That's fantastic, Michael. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge in part 1 about the history, and I'm looking forward in a minute.
Yeah, and we'll end this one actually not with our words, but with the words of the Shah of Iran. And we're going to play a 10-minute clip. So members, if you are listening to this on parallelmic.com, you can skip this part if you want and go straight to the next part of the interview, or you can listen to it now and then join us for part number 2. But for everyone else, I'm going to leave you with a clip from the Shah of Iran speaking in 1974 about the oil crisis.
60 Minutes Rewind.
Chances are your car is sat in your garage or driveway this weekend, and chances are that your local gas station is going to be closed a lot more Sundays this winter. What part does the Arab oil embargo play in all of this? One Middle East monarch thinks that you're being sold a bill of goods. To try to understand something of the background of the oil shortage, a 60 Minutes crew has spent the last 3 weeks in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and Iran, the 2 largest oil exporting countries in the world. Our story on Saudi Arabia is still in work, but in Iran, earlier this week, we went to see the man who runs that country and, in effect, its oil industry.
Shah Mohammed Ritza Pahlavi is not an Arab. He makes a point of calling himself Aryan. And unlike the Arabs, he will sell oil to anyone if the price is right. Along with the Arabs, he is a member of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's the group that is holding the world's feet to the fire with the rocketing price of oil. This week in Tehran, the Shah offered to put up $1 billion, and he can afford it, of his oil money, for a fund that would cushion the devastating economic effect of the oil crunch on the have-not nations. And he took time out in his Niavaran palace to talk to us.
Sheikh Yamani told me a week ago in Riyadh that he was very optimistic that during February there was going to come the disengagement between Syria and Israel and the oil embargo would be lifted. He was optimistic. That optimism obviously has turned sour. Why? Do you know?
Well, there might be many reasons. One is that I don't know why you attach so much importance to this embargo on the United States, really. Why should you care about that? You are not short of oil.
Have you seen the lines of cars stretching for blocks, in some cases for miles, waiting to get gas?
I have seen the pictures.
And you cannot
But you have imported more oil than any time in the past.
Well, not recently we haven't.
You have?
You mean we are still importing more oil than we were, let's say, in September? You believe that?
I can't say for sure. But what is certain is that you are not importing less.
Than we were importing last September? Then this whole thing is a fraud?
You know that ships are changing their destinations 2 or 3 times in the oceans. You sell the oil for a certain destination and it ends up somewhere else?
What you seem to be saying is that there is some fraud involved, that there is something going on that doesn't meet the eye.
Oh, something is going on for sure.
And who is being enriched by it?
The oil companies?
The oil companies.
You know that one oil company has made 67% interest this year and another one even more?
Well, the president of Aramco acknowledges.
Yes?
Not the president, the chairman of the board of Aramco acknowledged to us that their profits, the parent company, will go up by 400%.
Yes.
Next year, just as Iran's profits will go up by 400%.
Yes, but this is our wealth, our natural wealth. For them, it's only a question of manipulation.
As you know, I have been across the Gulf that you call Persian and they call Arabian.
Why do you call it Gulf? You have been to school, or haven't you?
Yes.
What was the name that you have read during your school days?
Persian Gulf.
All right.
But they do call it Arabian Gulf.
Well, they can do many things.
And they find an irony in the oil situation in this. They say, we impose the embargo against the United States, for instance, and the European countries. That drives the cost of oil up. Who benefits from the embargo? Iran, the Shah. Shah, who is the friend of Israel, benefits from the high price of oil caused by our embargo.
Yeah, but only enemies of Iran could have told you that. First of all, why friend of Israel?
Why?
In what sense?
Oh, economic cooperation.
How much?
I don't know the extent of it.
It doesn't come even to $2 or $3 million a year.
Intelligence cooperation.
You can get that kind of intelligence even in reading American newspapers.
It is common knowledge that they trained or helped to train your secret police, the Savak. You do have a relationship with the Israelis,
yes,
there's no doubt.
That's ridiculous, but we have the same relationship with all the friendly Arab countries that we train also in this country. This means nothing.
The industrial nations, among them, of course, the United States, feel that you, sir, have pushed too far, too fast, and that you can trigger worldwide depression by doing it. Henry Kissinger says so. Sheikh Yamani, the oil minister of Saudi Arabia, says so.
That suits them. I'm not talking about Yamani because I don't like to enter into that subject. But the others, it suits them to say that. Why? Because the price that we have set for oil was one of the lowest among the prices which were studied and suggested to the OPEC organization by all the experts.
You say you don't want to talk about Saudi Arabia and Sheikh Yamani. Well, nonetheless, Saudi Arabia, #1 oil producer, has certainly as great a stake as you do. And yet, he says, it's going to trigger depression. It's going to trigger trouble.
He has been told to say that. I'm sorry to say this.
By?
I'm not going to mention any names.
Well, by President Nixon?
I'm not going to mention any names. Ask the other member of the OPEC, all those experts in the OPEC, what they think.
But what kind of pressure can somebody put upon Sheikh Yamani to say it, unless his own king says say it?
You just go and ask those people.
Is it going to go down? Is it going to go up? Is it going to stay the same? The cost of oil...
It's going to go certainly up because, unfortunately, your inflation is going to go up.
Is it going to go up on April 1st when...
This I can't say.
Well, you sit down with your OPEC brothers in the next few weeks and you make a decision about the price of oil as of April 1st. Can you give us a horseback guess, Your Majesty?
I can't tell you, really. But all will depend on many factors. One is the attitude that the so-called industrial countries of the world are adopting. Is it a hostile attitude or a cooperative attitude?
You tell me, sir.
Second, it's the question of your inflation. The bill that they are every day presenting us is something ridiculous. The way that you are increasing your prices.
On?
Everything. Every kind of commodity.
For instance?
Say some spare parts for a radar station. That's only one little example. And from that you can go for everything.
Is it in retaliation for the rise of the crime?
No, it's because they cannot control their economy.
But you can.
We can, and that's what we call your society a permissive society.
Is that that's not the only reason you call our society a permissive society?
Not the only reason.
Your Majesty.
Not the only reason.
Well, this is not a pretty subject to bring up to His Imperial Majesty, but there are those from the West who say, look at the corruption in Iran. With all of the money in your own affluent economy, in your own swollen economy, so much money sticks to the hands of people in the government. They say you can't get a contract here, and everybody's here. You know that, vendors, contractors, without a little of truth.
I think it's the most unjust thing that is said. It's just jealousy. For instance, the military purchases, it's government to government. If there is a corruption, it's from your government or the government of every other country from which we buy. So this is the unfairest and most unjust thing that I have heard.
Is it possible, Your Majesty, that because you are so busy and because you have so many things occupying you, that it could be going on behind your back, sir?
No. It's impossible because I have at least 5 inspectorate organizations. One, sooner or later, they will be caught. And let me say this. First of all, I think this is a cheap accusation. Second, it is less than anything that you have in your so-called permissive society.
You mean you think there is more corruption in the United States than in...
Well, especially in your country, yes.
The story will continue after this.
You are one of the longest ruling monarchs in the world today, Your Majesty. 33 years, you've survived assassination attempts, internal strife, external threats. Why?
Why did I survive?
Yes.
Well, I believe in God. Ask Him.
You do?
I do.
I mean, very
serious.
deeply.
Oh, yes. And I think this is the only explanation.
You have said the only explanation. You said, I will stay alive until I finish what I set out to do.
What was set for me to do.
By God.
That's what I believe.
When you were a little boy, you saw visions, you saw apparitions. God came to you, or God's messenger came to you.
Yes.
For some of us in the West, that is difficult to comprehend. But I say you believe it. You say it.
I do.
What happened?
Started by dreams, then apparitions and feelings, but all in 1 year, not more, between the age of 6 and 7. And then it stopped.
You have no more dreams, apparitions, visions now?
Sometimes I have dreams which come true when I don't like it.
Assassination attempts?
No, not that.
But you had premonition, you
Not
had...
Not that. When I was a kid, once I dreamt that there was a pit full of snakes, and obviously people who are always translating the dreams told me that these are your enemies. Things like that. It happens to everybody, probably. But not that.
You sleep more soundly now?
With my sleeping pills, yes.
You take sleeping pills?
Since some time now. Well, it's really tranquilizers.
You know, very few leaders like yourself, Your Majesty, talk with the candor with which you have talked on television. Why? Why are you willing to?
First of all, I believe in what I say. Secondly, I'm not afraid of my people. It's not a political campaign. I'm not going to look at the polls tomorrow to see if I'm 2 degrees higher or lower. And that's because this confidence exists between me and my people. They trust in me, I trust in them. I believe that I know the job. So I'm not trembling. in thinking or saying what I say, because I know that tomorrow I won't have to go to the polls.
What you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you the people have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.